Okay, I think we'll get started now. There might still be a few people trickling in, but it's a good number of you already joined, so we won't keep you hanging on too long. So thanks everyone for coming along to this session. My name's Becky. I'm the Coalition Coordinator at Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, and we are a group of over 50 organisations made up of charities, community groups, other organisations who campaign together on climate change, and we lobby the government to do more on climate in Scotland and other international kind of climate issues. So we've got some of our members who are going to be taking us through this session today, and the aim of the session is to share some information on what's happening with the current Scottish Government climate change plan, why this plan is important, what things we want it to include, and just a bit about how you can get involved in calling for action on climate at the moment in Scotland. So I'll just let everyone introduce themselves when they start their bit in the meeting. There's just a few things to mention about Zoom. So hopefully you're all Zoom pros by now, but I know there might be some people who are a bit unfamiliar about how everything works. But you should all be on mute now, so we can't hear any background noise in your homes. So just try and keep on mute unless you're going to be asking a question or something. We will have time for questions at the end. So we're going to be doing quite a lot of talking at you for the first part of the meeting, and then we'll open it up at the end so we can have a bit of a discussion and you can ask any questions. So try and save all those up till the end. If there is anything you really want to put to us straight away, or you can use the chat box. So if you hover over the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see an option called chat, and then the chat box should appear in the bottom right corner of the screen. So you can ask us things on that if you like. I just want to also let you know that this session is being broadcast live on YouTube, so that more people can see it and so that we can share it afterwards. So if you're not happy with that, then please just turn your camera off or send me a message and let me know. So I think that's all I wanted to say for the introduction. I'm going to hand over to Andrew now to kick us off. Thanks, everybody.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Midgley. I'm delighted to see you all. So I'm Senior Land Use Policy Officer at RSPB Scotland, but I'm speaking to you this evening in my capacity as the chair of the SCCS Policy and Advocacy Group. So what I plan to do is just go through a few slides to explain a little bit about the climate change plan and what we think about it. So I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully this will work for you. Okay, so I'm hoping that this is working for you. Becky, can you give me a thumbs up if that's okay? Yeah, okay, great. So what I'm going to do is just go through a few slides. I'll rattle through these because I'm aware that we want to give you time to ask questions and hopefully answer as best we can. So what I've been asked to do a couple of things. The first thing is, so just explain a little bit about the climate change plan update and why it's important. So I'm just going to go through a few elements of that. So some of the background, what it's for, what's the purposes, what's in it, and what's happening right now. And then I'll go on to just look at some of what we think about it. So let's just go straight into, so what is the climate change plan update and what it's about? So where this comes from, I should say, I'm aware there'll be lots of people who are fully embedded in sort of climate change policy, but there'll be lots of people who don't necessarily sort of have that background, so I'm kind of going to go quite broad, so please bear with me if you're totally up to speed with this, but I'll kind of be quite brief as we go. So a key milestone in climate change policy in Scotland was the Climate Change Scotland Act in, that should be 2009, and what that did was it created statutory targets and a plan for a set of processes by which we were going to deal with climate change in Scotland. So it set out a target for reducing emissions by 80% by 2050, and it set out some annual targets and created processes through which we were going to try and keep on top of it. And one of those processes was a requirement on the government to produce a report on policies and proposals. This was the mechanism through which the government would explain how it was going to meet its annual targets and the overall targets for 2050. Now, the government has produced several of those, so 3 to date, and the climate change plan that was produced in 2018 was the 3rd of those. But what happened since then was a real acceleration in climate change sort of thinking and advocacy, and we had big reports at a global scale from IPCC, essentially saying that we weren't going far enough, fast enough, and that governments needed to do more. So we effectively started the government's, so that coincided with the government looking again at climate change and pressure on climate change. And so what we ended up with in Scotland was a new climate change set of targets. So we are now aiming for the target of net zero by 2045 and 75% reduction from 1990 levels by 2030. So these are really quite stretching targets. So what we have is this legislative framework, and the climate change plan is embedded in that. And the purpose of the plan, if I can just go to the next slide, is to set out by sector how we're going to get on the path to meet our annual targets. And what the plan does is essentially sets out a set of policies and proposals that the government is going to take forward in order for us to meet those targets. The plan is done periodically, and so those policies and proposals change over time. So the climate change plan update was needed because of those changes in targets. So what we were planning to do, what was in the original intention of the Climate Change Act, was to get to this 8% reduction from 1990 levels by 2050. That's the black line, effectively. This is my very simple schematic illustration. It wasn't that linear, but you get the idea that we were heading towards that level of ambition. But with the new targets, actually, we have to go much further, much faster. Hence the need for the update. So the 2018 plan became out of date very quickly, needed to be updated. And that's what this new document is doing. We have to do a lot more quickly. So what's included, as previous climate change plans, they take a sectoral approach and it breaks down what's going to happen in each of those sectors according to the government. So this sets out an envelope for each sector in terms of emissions reductions, and it includes a set of policies. These are sort of more crunchy and definite things that the government's going to do, and a set of proposals which are slightly more aspirational or long-term, or setting the direction which may be picked up as policies in the future. So there's a series of sectors there. I won't read through them all. Which stay through each plan. The update includes another sector, which is negative emission technologies. So there's a sort of increasing focus on innovation towards removing carbon in various ways from the atmosphere. And so that's been picked up in the update. So we have this new update, and it's going into Parliament. So it was laid in Parliament in mid-December, and immediately the Parliament cranked into gear and did a call for evidence for committees seeking input from across civil society, and the lead committee, the ECLI committee, the Environment, Climate Change, Land Reform Committee, is taking broad evidence, and then there are sort of sectoral looks from other committees as well. And that call for evidence closed this week, and the SCCS provided evidence into that process. What the various committees now do is take evidence prior to coming to some conclusions, and the government, I think, is hoping to finalise all of this by the end of this parliamentary session. So what's happened has been influenced by COVID-19. The plan was that this update should have been introduced to Parliament in April last year, but for obvious reasons, it's all been delayed. But that means that things are a bit squeezed now, and there's a bit of a juggling act, because we want to try and get the best scrutiny we can on the climate change plan update, but it's actually compressed, but for obvious reasons, and there's a kind of a sort of necessity to that. But we also want to see progress quickly, so we have to kind of make the best we can of the situation. So let me now move on to just some initial thoughts about what SCCS thinks. Now, these are very text heavy. I appreciate that, but hopefully if I'm going to rattle through them, and we can come back to questions, and hopefully it's not too full on, but hopefully if there's something that captures your attention, then there'll be a takeaway from every slide. So the first overall point, actually, it's really good to see this update. We've been waiting for it. Obvious reasons it's been delayed, but actually we need it, and we need to get on track. Our new targets are so stretching that we need urgent action. And so this is absolutely essential. The second point, and it's really important to recognize this, is that because of coronavirus, the context is really important, and something that's central in the climate change plan update is thinking about green recovery. How can the government sort of tackle these two things at once? Can we get green recovery and do everything we need to do to meet our new climate targets? And so that's the tenor of the whole document is got that running through it. So when we get to looking at what's actually in it, I think it's mixed. I mean, the government has increased ambition. It needs to. We've got new targets, and it looks like it's getting close to reaching the 2030 targets. That is the most pressing target, and is in legislation. And we have to do what we can to meet it. And it's really quite a challenge. And so it looks like the government is including in the plan action that will get it close to that target. But there is, I have to say, quite a degree of opaqueness around the data and the ability to understand the degree to which particular actions deliver certain levels of emissions reduction. So we're kind of still trying to get our heads around exactly the degree to which we get close to that target. So the next point I'd just flag is that actually there is quite a lot of activity that's in the plan, but it's actually quite short term. So there isn't a coherent sequenced set of events. Now there's a degree of, we have to understand that there's a degree of sort of, we can really focus on the near term, but we do actually need a coherent plan, and some of that is lacking in several sectors. And I think there's also, a tendency to, there are lots of good commitments in here, but there's also a tendency to think that we also need to revisit plans and visions and strategies, and that doesn't necessarily equate with real action. There are things you can say that go in the plan, but they aren't necessarily taking you, very far forward. I'd say some of our colleagues are particularly concerned within SCCS that there's some of the technologies that are included, some of the negative emissions technologies may be sort of over relied upon. So if we're thinking about innovation that's yet to happen, but then depending upon it to deliver emissions reductions, then there's an issue there. And then the final point, just in the overview, is that just transition is also running through this document. And again, that's a positive thing. That's something SCCS wants to see. I think there's some of our colleagues felt that there wasn't necessarily a commitment to a plan or updated strategy on how that will actually be delivered. So there's talk about just transition, but actually what does that mean? So now I'm going to rattle through some of the points on different sectors. I won't go through all the sectors, but I'll just highlight some of the key issues for us. So first of all, with agriculture, land use and marine, so I'm kind of lumping something through two sectors here together. So there is an increase in ambition in agriculture. It was like a 9% reduction, which was next to nothing. It's gone up, and it has to. That's a good thing, but it's still smaller than other sectors. But there is a change in tenor in agriculture, which is positive. There are some things included in there which are potentially really interesting. So a focus on environmental conditionality, which is like putting more rules on, if you're receiving public money, these are the things that you have to do in order to receive that public money. And if they're related to the environment, then that's a good thing. But there's a bit of lack of detail in there. The woodland creation targets are not necessarily new in the sense that they go beyond what was in the 2018 plan by 3,000 hectares, but the aim of establishing 18,000 hectares of new woodland a year was announced earlier in the year and in the budget. So the update doesn't necessarily take us any further forward than that. And there's also, whilst there are good sounding things on trying to talk about phasing out the use of peat in horticulture, it doesn't talk about actually being a bit more strong on that. So the Committee on Climate Change says that the government should ban it. The government has suggested that it wants to think about licensing muirburn, but it didn't include it in the update. So there's things that could be improved there. One thing that's missing is around deer management. So it's potentially a really big issue for peatland restoration and woodland creation, but there's not necessarily a focus on that. So, and then the final thing around marine is there's reference to blue carbon, but there isn't necessarily doesn't look like there's a great emphasis or desire to push that forward. So I will move forward on to other sectors. So buildings and electricity, again, two lumps together here. I think it's fair to say that these comments have been provided by colleagues. And so in here, some of the comments, the long-term objectives for the heats and building strategy are very welcome. Some of the measures are comprehensive, and I think we are, relatively comfortable with some of what's been proposed. So we're willing to welcome things when they are good. So the proposal to introduce regulations for all buildings to achieve a good level of energy efficiency is welcome. There isn't, though, a commitment to phase out high carbon heating in off-grid areas by 2025. So, it's a mixed picture. The proposal to invest 1.6 billion in heat and energy efficiency over the next Parliament, again, is welcome. So overall, I think we're willing to say that the policies and proposals to further develop renewable energy and electricity production are generally welcome. So my colleagues that focus on this area are relatively warm, receiving things relatively warmly. Not to say that there isn't room for improvement. I think the same can be said about transport as well. So some of these things are welcome. So a new target to reduce car kilometers by 20% by 2030 is welcome. The intention to create active freeways is potentially welcome, because that could link with a whole aspiration to develop and design strategic active travel networks. So again, potentially welcome, depends on the detail. But some of the things that are less welcome here, or not quite as what we had hoped, I suppose, would be actually there is not a commitment to stop new trunk roads and motorways, and that actually the active travel budget is going to be 3% rather than the 10% of the transport budget that we were asking for. And there is actually no real action on aviation. And so we had called for the frequent flyer levy, and that didn't come forward. And there's no mention of achieving zero emission zones in each city. So a mixed bag, but some welcome policies and proposals from government there. And then my last slide is on waste. I'm jumping around a little bit in my comments here, but hopefully you're following. The last slide is on waste. So the commitment to look at how to make incinerators less damaging was welcome, but it didn't go as far as we would want. We would actually don't want to see new ones. So, there is room for improvement, or we think there's room for improvement there. The investment to deliver recycling targets, we think, falls short of what's needed and compares actually poorly with Wales. And there's no commitment. I think there's the delay around the levy on single-use plastics. And so at the moment, there's no commitment to which single-use plastics could be banned, or the promotion of the alternatives. So there's a range of things on waste as well. So I would simply say that if I was going to sum this up, I would say that it's really good to see that the plan is there. It's getting the scrutiny. There are some things we like. Big picture wise, it looks like it's taking us most of the way there, but actually it's a bit scant on the detail when we try to get our head around the figures. There are some good elements, but some of the detail is a bit missing. There isn't necessarily a fully coherent plan for the whole period of the plan. There's a great deal of emphasis in the short term. And I think it doesn't quite go as far as we would want it to in terms of all the commitments. So we have an opportunity in coming up in the coming period to try and press for some changes, just whilst the plan's getting scrutiny in Parliament. So I think I will pause there. I am very happy to take comments. When your comments come, I might not necessarily be able to answer all your questions, because as this is such a broad range of topics, this has been put together by people with different interests. So if I can't answer your questions, then I'll take it away and try and get an answer to you. But now I think I'm passing on to a colleague who's looking at international issues. So pass over. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Anne from Scottish Catholic International Aid Fund, and I'll be talking you through international if Becky pulls up slides. Oops, we might need to go tab back a bit. So probably most of you sort of already sort of know this already. I think I see some familiar faces from the session this morning. So as we know, the climate crisis, the climate emergency is here now. People are facing throughout the world increased droughts, floods, food shortages, forced migration, and that's the reality for people now. Never mind what's kind of coming sort of down the line. So if we tab forward. So, you know, nearly 2 years ago in Mozambique, Cyclone Idai hit. It was the kind of worst national disaster in 2 decades. It destroyed as much as 50% of Mozambique's annual crops and killed more than 500 people. And we know that more intense and frequent events, weather events, are happening because of climate change. And because of the impact that this has on countries like Mozambique, they are forced to kind of shift kind of budgets from health and kind of social security and the like into kind of dealing with the kind of climate disasters that are unfolding. If we tab forward. So as part of COP15, rich countries had promised to actually address some of this damage that is already being done. At the moment, they promised to mobilize 100 billion in additional financing to help poor countries both adapt and mitigate to the effects of climate change. You may be unsurprised to learn that these promises have not been met. This obviously impacts on people's life chances throughout the world. If we tab forward. So Oxfam did a kind of brilliant report, I think came out the kind of tail end of last year. I've got the link to the report later on in the links here that looked at actually how much money has actually come forward. So they estimated somewhere in the region of 59.5 billion had kind of be put forward in climate finance, but actually the devil, as always, is in the detail. Actually, real kind of climate specific assistance was estimated at around 19 to 22 billion. More of those kind of big kind of projects are going towards kind of mitigation as opposed to adaptation, the impacts of climate change that's happening at the moment. Most of it is in loans, which is, I think, inherently unjust. This is climate change that is impacting on countries that have done the least to cause it and are most impacted in it. So why should it be kind of delivered in the case of loans? That isn't climate justice. Only 20.5% of it went to least developed countries and just 3% of that to small island states. So those most impacted are getting the least amount of the money to help them adapt and mitigate to the effects of climate change. Also worrying is that climate finance is making up an increasing portion of overseas development aid, so not sort of additional sort of monies. And that was something that kind of richer countries had kind of promised to do. And it's hard to tell how much private climate finance is being mobilized towards that 100 billion kind of target. And it's not necessarily, and we know this for a fact, not reaching the kind of poorest hit communities or ensuring that that kind of grassroots adaptation kind of projects are really kind of coming through. If we tab forward. So some of the examples of kind of adaptation kind of projects, which I think in some ways kind of highlight how it can actually make women and girls' lives much better. So you've got things like rainwater harvesting installations and reverse osmosis technology that can provide clean water supply. So that kind of harvesting approach, raising toilets so that you know, when floods and storms happen, that's still kind of secure, which means that girls and women don't have to kind of travel further for for water, or spend more time kind of finding kind of clean water supplies, and thereby kind of securing their safety, being far closer to home. If we tab forward. So in the kind of Climate Change Scotland Act in 2019, there were a number of amendments that were made, and three key kind of clauses sort of in there, and this was through lobbying by the Stop Climate Chaos kind of Scotland. So this is where kind of Scottish ministers were asked to kind of put forward proposals and policies for the kind of sharing of expertise and kind of technology transfer, and to set out how this implementation of this plan is expected to contribute to the achievement of sustainable development, so the UN Sustainable Development Goals with a target of kind of 2030, and that the plan must have regard to the climate justice principles. So those least responsible for climate change, most impacted by it, should be kind of given kind of support to help them adjust that, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. We tab forward. So what's in the climate change plan update? As Andrew said, it came out just before kind of Christmas, and one of the things it kind of highlights is that Scotland has become the kind of co-chair of the Under 2 coalition, which is a coalition of over kind of 220 devolved countries, cities and states. So this is kind of an important sort of role that kind of Scotland can have to kind of actually champion kind of climate justice sort of principles. The plan talks about ensuring, or the update rather, talks about ensuring COP26 talks are as inclusive as they can be, but most worrying is there is absolutely no mention, unlike sort of the Act in 2019, about climate justice and what's meant by that. So what is the coalition calling for? If we tab forward. So it kind of splits into kind of two main things. It's about encouraging the Scottish Government to be a kind of good global citizen and kind of demonstrate world leadership by championing the issue of climate justice, and particularly increasing the Climate Justice Fund. And also to lead the way in promoting something called loss and damage, which is this kind of principle that has kind of been embedded within the kind of climate change sort of negotiations. There needs to be more movement on this. This is where countries are already impacted and dealing with the effects of climate change, and there needs to be some form of kind of compensation to that, to this concept of loss and damage. So we're calling for very kind of three kind of tangible things: to increase the Climate Justice Fund, which is one of the kind of first kind of justice funds in the world. It's been sitting at 3 million for a number of years. It needs to kind of be raised significantly to address the kind of real challenges of climate change happening now. It needs to align with UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we need to ensure that there's what we call policy coherence, making sure that any policies that are kind of being carried out domestically or have an impact internationally are aligning with the kind of principles of UN Sustainable Development Goals. And for the Scottish Government to formally engage with the most impacted countries and communities in the Global South ahead of the conference, to make sure that they're providing a platform and they're championing the agendas that developing countries, least developed countries in particular, want to be heard at the conference table. If we tap forward. So there's a big long list of asks, which are kind of sourced from a number of different documents policy documents that we have done over the past few months, some of which I've kind of partly sort of talked about. But obviously, Scotland has a historical role in contributing to kind of climate change. We have kind of oil fields and but we've got a real role by hosting COP to really kind of act on behalf of or provide that platform for the Global South to be heard, so that we have a much more just deal going forward in November. We tab forward. And there's a number of other kind of documents that lay out in greater depth some of the things that I've kind of briefly alluded to. And that's the end. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for that, Anne. That was great, and just thought it was important to kind of not only focus on what's happening on the domestic side, but also kind of set the scene on the global picture, because obviously what we do in Scotland has an impact internationally. So that's really great. Thank you. I'm just going to, there's one more speaker before you can ask some questions, and we'll stop kind of talking at you. So I'm going to pass over to Erica now, who's going to talk to you a bit about what we're calling for you to do to help us show the Scottish Government what we want to see in the plan.
Thanks very much, Becky. It always makes me nervous when these things are streamed to YouTube because I have this like fear that my mom is suddenly going to call in the middle of one of these meetings and it's going to be a really awkward interruption. But we'll just hope that doesn't happen. I see some of the questions coming by in the chat and they're really good, and we'll get to them as soon as humanly possible, I promise. And also the bit about the Citizens Climate Assembly, that comment from Francine, that's spot on. So really awesome. Thank you. Just to give everybody a bit of perspective, I just want to remind you that we're trying to do some advocacy on the climate plan in a time that is obviously like where people and systems I think are very vulnerable. And it's not just about COVID. Obviously, we're talking about Brexit and like, you know, Americans storming the Capitol building and all kinds of international uncertainty. And so given that context, I'm not trying to downplay the importance of this at all. I'm just saying, in fact, the climate plan is more important than ever because we do know that this is a year of the COP and that health is tied to nature and the climate and that we do need to be taking action on it. So it's kind of balancing what we need to achieve urgently and immediately with the new constraints on us that were perhaps not what we expected 6 months ago when we knew that this climate change plan update was coming. And to just kind of flag also that this is an update, it's not an actual new plan. The new plan isn't coming for a couple of more years. And so the ambition might be a little bit low, but this update is how we are going to achieve our 2030 targets. So if we don't have the detail that's necessary in this update, if the detail doesn't match the rhetoric, then we're not going to reach where we need to go. So that's one of the reasons I'm going to talk to you now about the campaign action and tell you how you can help. And I assume Becky at some point is going to share a slide. And if not, then I'm just going to keep talking to my own face. And that would be kind of fun. There's just one slide for me, and it's basically how you can help. So what we have done, considering all that we need to do this year with elections and the COP, and also kind of thinking about capacity constraints for both our audience and for ourselves, is create an e-action which is meant to operate as a bit of a petition. So it's an email to target, which means that when you complete it, an email will be generated and sent to Rosanna Cunningham. But rather than sending it on to her, we will collect them and collate them back at SCCS. And we will pull out the emails that are actually have been adjusted and amended to point out specific things related to the climate plan. So it ends up operating as a bit of a petition where we hand it over to her and we say, okay, we have 1,000 people who have signed on to this and want to see detail in the climate change plan and want you to take action that matches your rhetoric. But also, in case you don't want to read 1,000 emails, please do check these 10, 20, 100, 200 that are specifically addressed and have something for you to read. We think that it would be quite successful if we get between 1,500 and 5,000 emails or sign-ons, and to just point out what that looks like relatively, the recent Scottish Environment Link petition on the continuity bill got 7,000 plus signatures. So, you know, I'm going to aim a little bit lower than that, although perhaps I should be more ambitious. I did read a statistic somewhere today that said any climate petition needed to, cut through needed to have somewhere like 100,000 signatures. So if you all do that for me, oh my God, I might just cry. Probably not. I'd probably laugh hysterically because that tends to be the way that I deal with things. Anyway, what do we need you to do? We need you to watch for this petition, this e-action, which is live and ready to go and will come around in an email tomorrow. We have generated a set of guidelines to go along with the headlines that Andrew and Anne have presented to you. And so we'll send those headlines as well. The guidelines will tell you how to complete the e-action and what you can do in the email to adjust it. And then what I'm calling flair. So feel free to send the email just as is, but also it might help if you adjusted it a little bit and added some of your own personal experiences or asks as they relate to the climate plan. And then we need you to share it. So as members and member organizations of SCCS, or perhaps members of your own communities, please do tell your friends and neighbors that this is the first of many useless, well, not useless, really important e-actions that you will share with them this year, and that they actually need to take action on this one, because if they don't, we still are not going to get the detail that we need from the Scottish government. And then share it on social. So in those guidelines, you'll see a bunch of hashtags and account names for the committees that will be reviewing the climate change plan update. And so we'd like you to tag people and say, hey, we're watching. And we want you to sit up and take notice and start taking action. And if you're not sure how to adjust the email, take the e-action or post something on social or even share it with your networks, I will put my email in the chat and you should feel free to get in touch, because I always enjoy conversations with lots of people and hearing what they're up to and answering their questions. And I'm not even being sarcastic about that. I'm American. We don't understand sarcasm. So I'm going to end there because I think the discussion is really important and we want to get to some of these questions. And so Becky, I will hand it back to you.
Thanks very much, Erica. So yeah, I haven't really been keeping up to date with what's been happening in the chat. So I'm going to go as far to the first question, I think. And if you, I'll see if you want to kind of come off mute and ask the question yourself. So Andrew, I think you've replied to the first one already. Is that one kind of been done on kind of how the sectors kind of speak to each other?
I gave a quick answer in the chat, but if Kath wanted to expand where she was coming from, that would be very welcome.
Hi, I think it all sounds very positive, but it worries me when things are very sectoral and everybody's moving in their own direction. Because sometimes those directions can actually be in different directions. And I think this has got one direction. And so I want to know whether the sectors are talking to each other.
So thanks, Kath. I think you're absolutely right that there can be challenges when things are approached sectorally. To be fair to the government, the way that we have to account for greenhouse gases in the greenhouse gas inventory is organised sectorally. And so the government is kind of organising itself in a way that makes sense for it to keep tabs on how it needs to report internationally, and so it does make sense how it's organised, but it does then absolutely create this challenge, which is if you're creating policy on a sectoral basis, how do you get all these different arms to fit together? So I think it would be to be fair to government, they recognise that the problem is delivering it. So how do you the inertia, I guess, is built into government to some degree by its own structure. So I'm thinking of in my field, you've got agriculture, which has its own sort of department, if you like, within government, and you've got Scottish Forestry, which is its own entity, and they have to try and speak to each other and build in the processes to make sure that they all work together. And then it all relates to funding. So I think I would probably say that there is the aspiration, there is crossover. The government, I think, is aware of this, but you're absolutely right to flag it as something that we need to keep right at the forefront of thinking.
Thanks, Andrew. Leslie had a question about aviation. Do you want to ask that directly, Leslie?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much for your presentations. Andrew, you mentioned the aviation. I can't remember the detail, but I was surprised that it seemed a bit weak, and I was also a bit surprised that your response to it didn't suggested that they were acceptable. So just comment, please.
Yeah, fair enough, Leslie. I hold my hand up and say that I probably skated over aviation, and that's totally down to the circumstances of me trying to get through as much as I can. What I could do is ask if Becky could point you in the direction of one of my colleagues that has the detail on aviation, if you're looking for the precise response, and hopefully that would give you some comfort. I can't tell you exactly, where we're at the moment.
Just to come in on that quickly, I think what Stop Climate Chaos Scotland were calling for was this kind of frequent flyer levy, which would be a way of kind of reducing demand for air travel, I guess, and it's a way of kind of introducing a levy on passengers that are taking lots and lots of flights every year, and a way of kind of raising money for other things out of that, I guess. So that's one of the things we thought would make a real impact on passenger numbers. but that wasn't something that was included in the plan. But I'm not sure. I think the thing that they included was something to do with kind of technology that, yeah, I might have to get another colleague to reply on that. But yeah, if you want to send me a message, Leslie, then I'm happy to follow that up for you. But
yeah, thank you.
Who else have we got on here? Stephen Gray, do you want to say anything about your question?
Hi, Becky. Thanks. Yeah, that'd be cool. When I read through the Climate Change Action Plan for Unison Scotland between Christmas and New Year, I was struck by it seemed to be very private sector led, and there wasn't very many commitments to the local government side or the central government side from the Scottish Government's estate and the NHS in Scotland as well. I was just a wee bit wary. There's a couple of lines in there, like the carbon, especially with the line with regard to planting woodlands with carbon investors. And then there was, I say, an awful lot of reliance on carbon capture and storage technology. I got the impression that it was a wee bit of a rush for the Climate Change Action Plan. And I think we also have issues in this part of the world, in the northeast of Scotland, with BP now promoting themselves as experts in sustainable development and offering to come along and help with the sustainable development and the climate change action plans for local authorities. So I'm just worried. I noticed there's representative of the Scottish Government here as well at today's meeting. So I'm just a wee bit worried that there's some Trojan horses planted in this action plan that we're going to come to regret if we're not careful.
Thanks, Stephen. I think you're right to have identified that there does seem to be a change of I don't know, tone, if you like, tenor or content on this particular issue. I don't think there is a detailed breakdown of the relative balance of public and private.
Yeah.
But you're right. I have to be completely open with everyone here. My area of expertise, if you like, is around sort of agriculture, land use, forestry, those sorts of areas. And if I think about the content in those sections, there is a much greater emphasis on looking towards developing private sector investment, whether that is to do with investment in the Woodland Carbon Code or in trying to draw in investment in peatland management. Now, from the government's point of view, I suspect there's a sort of reality to this, which is if the degree of change that's required is going to cost a lot. And so it has to be paid for. And so the government is trying to find ways to deliver the change if it actually doesn't necessarily know, how much it's going to have to spend, because at the moment we're on sort of annual budgets. And so you can see where they're coming from, but it does leave quite a lot open to the private sector and delivery. So that there must, going forward, be quite a strong role for government here in terms of providing the context for the operation of the private sector at the very least, and not just create a sort of market free-for-all and hope that it delivers what you want. The government will have to be really quite providing the context within which it operates.
Yeah, now that sounds good. The lack of context is the worrying side. The other thing, just to throw into the balance, there's not, we talk about just climate justice and social justice, but the same equally applies to Scotland, where if you look at the Scottish Land Commission information, this could be a tremendous opportunity to empower the communities in the remoter part of Scotland to actually manage the assets within surrounding their communities, with regard to carbon capture from the peatlands or from the woodland creation and rewilding or whatever. So the communities in charge of the assets, which once upon a time used to belong to their ancestors or to the communities that occupied that place several hundred years ago. But anyway, thank you very much.
No problem, thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Some really good points there, I think. Francine, do you want to say anything about the Citizens Climate Assembly that's happening at the moment?
Yes. Well, I mean, it's in my question really. I've been observing some of the process, and I'm quite impressed with how it's being carried out. I'm particularly impressed by the evidence givers who have produced a series of tremendous videos, which I would recommend everyone has a browse of by visiting the website. I've given the contact there, and they're short videos, but the impression you get is, yes, of course, that's what we should be doing. You've got all the answers. It's all been worked out, and this is very frustrating because the government still seems to be dragging their heels. And I mean, you're talking about a new plan that's not going to be ready for another 3 years. Well, time is running out. We've got to speed things up, and this concerns me. And there just is not a sense of urgency that there needs to be. And I mean, the only kind of silver lining of COVID, which has kind of eclipsed the work we need to be doing on climate change, the only silver lining, if you can call it that, is that that governments have demonstrated that they can react and change instantly if necessary. And I just hope that the sort of financial side of things isn't always going to hold everything up or stop good decisions being made. But what I'm wanting to know is how much liaising is there between these two bodies that are kind of trying to come up with the best plans and the best results, because the Citizens Climate Assembly, I'm very encouraged by the kinds of actions that they're talking about and the proposals that seem to be formulating.
Francine, which two bodies are you referring to? The Assembly and
the Stop Climate Chaos Scotland and the people, the body that produced this plan that you were explaining to us, and the Citizens Assembly. Okay. I mean, there are zillions of organizations and movements now, all kind of feverishly kind of working out, what we should be doing, and nobody's listening to anybody else.
Yeah. So my understanding is the government had a foundational role in establishing the process, but it's sort of operating at arm's length. That secretariat has then been inviting the people to take part, and I think I would have to go and check, but I would suspect that some SCCS members have been involved. But I think that what's also happening is that representatives of organisations are asked to observe and take part.
MSPs have been. That was how I got involved. I've been asking people to.
Yeah. I don't think, Becky can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's been a formal liaison with the Assembly and SCCS. But I think we would be very happy to. I do have a comment on assemblies, so I'll come to Becky in a second. The thing about these assemblies, and I think you're right to point to them as being really quite constructive, is that they're really helpful because one of the things that government, I think this is me looking at government from the outside, I suspect the politicians struggle a little bit with the really potentially unpopular things that might be needed to be done on climate change because it's electorally difficult. But one of the things that came out of the Citizens' Assembly that happened down south last year was that it became much more apparent that the public were willing to accept those unpalatable things because they recognized the scale of the issue and that things needed to be done. So this sort of process can give politicians confidence to act more quickly. And so they're potentially really, really important processes. And so, yes, I'll come to Becky. I think if SCCS can be involved, then we would be very, very happy to be.
I have a feeling that anyone can ask to be an observer. You don't have to be invited by anyone. You can apply, and if there's space available, then you just do it through the website. If anyone else is interested.
We've definitely been promoting that to our members and supporters, that the fact that you can go and observe every weekend. So that's really good. And I think we've kind of just been almost waiting to see what happens at the end, because we're really interested to see if, like Andrew said, if it does come up with these results that show that there is support for action, a bit like what we're trying to show through this process. We're trying to show that there's support from the public for strong action on climate from the government. And part of that is through this plan, part of that is through the Citizens Assembly. So there's all these different things that we can use to show that. And so I think I'm really looking forward to seeing the outcome of that, to see what we can use to say, like, later on, to show that people have got an interest in this.
Thank you. But if I could just, before I stop, really encourage people to go onto the website and look at all these expert evidence givers videos. They're very short, and they're not government people. They're people out there who have been working in these different fields for all their lives. And as I say, the answers are all there. It's just a case of, and the public can even sort of push that as part of the emailing, that by referring to these if they've seen them and like them. Thank you.
That's really useful. Thanks, Francine. Erica, did you want to say anything about that, or did we cover that already?
No, I mean, I will come in just a minute just to say, like, I think, SCCS has not been formally liaising on the Citizens Assembly, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because we know that SCCS is a coalition of organizations that care about the climate. And so we are fairly representative of a lot of different organizations. And so we don't want to monopolize all of the views of the public on the government. By allowing the Citizens Assembly to proceed in tandem, we are essentially allowing more voices to be heard. And I agree with Andrew's point about the fact that it is a really valuable process. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that it is a climate emergency and we do need to take action. So I totally hear what a lot of people in this meeting are saying about the fact that we need to be holding the Scottish government to account and make sure that their rhetoric is matched with detailed plans to take action on the climate. And like Andrew said, when things are done well, of course, we'll acknowledge that they're done well, but it's part of our job as an advocacy organization to offer some solutions and to poke the bear every now and then and ask them to take stronger action. I just to quickly also answer the two questions on mainstreaming, which came up about working together across portfolios. I don't want to let that go either, because that is really important, right? One thing we have learned from the pandemic is the fact that nature and climate affect everything else, right? And so if we talk about health, we should be talking about nature and climate. If we talk about education, we should be talking about nature and climate. And Scottish Environment Link right now is talking about mainstreaming as one of the things that they are interested in seeing in the Scottish government. And I think it's one of the things that we can ask for. And I really do encourage all of you to use that e-action and other avenues like the Citizens Assembly to take a moment to ask for the specific things that we need to see on the climate, because there are many of them. And one of those, of course, includes integrating nature and the climate across all portfolios. I'm going to stop now because I don't want to take up too much more time.
Thanks, Erica. Yeah, I'm aware we've only got a few minutes left, so I'm just going to have a quick look to see if there's anything else that's come in. Alexandra, did you want to say anything? We've kind of covered some of those. Did you want to ask anything else based on your comment in the chat?
No, I think the comment about the Citizens' Assemblies maybe directly answered that there needs to be a voice heard, and the Citizens' Assemblies seem to be doing a really good job of that.
Great. Okay, thank you, Alexandra. Is there any final questions or comments or anything? Otherwise, I'd just say, please do look out for your emails to see what's coming through with all the information that we've just talked about. And yeah, just get in touch with me if you have any other questions or anything. But does anyone want to add anything else? Well, we've just got a few more minutes. No? Okay, brilliant. I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming along and giving up an hour of your day to come and hear us talking about this, and for all your really interesting input and discussion at the end, and to all of our speakers who've hopefully explained everything really clearly for you and to put some time into presenting that. So thank you, everybody, and hopefully speak to you again soon.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. I always lose this bit.